All right, we're live. So, hello, welcome everyone for a new episode of the Navarra Confidencial TV podcast, I suppose. We're not live, we're recording this on San Valentine's night, so February 14. And today is joining me Elizabeth. How do you pronounce your name?
So
Elizabeth or Elizabeth?
Elizabeth.
Okay. Um, from the UK. And some people might remember her like back in the day, I think like 1 or 2 years ago as the Rule Britannia girl. So welcome. It's good to have you here.
Thank you.
So, well, speaking of, since I already kind of introduced you, um, tell us a little bit about yourself and especially how that came to be because it was somewhat viral, at least in conservative circles in social
Yeah,
media.
it's been for nearly 3 years now, and I still haven't heard the end of it. So I'm a history and politics student at Aberdeen University in Scotland, and I'm in my final semester now. And people remember me from my first year when I got kicked out my student union for saying "Rule Britannia," and it blew up in the press.
So I mean, it's quite a story, and most people need even more context about that because, well, British university culture tends to be quite different from what we have in the rest of the world. Maybe a little similar to the one in the United States, definitely very different to what there is in continental Europe. I mean, maybe Poland has something similar. I mean, there are student associations here, but they tend to be quite they gatekeep a lot of people politically, so that people that go to the Catholic Students Association, they tend to be more conservative. People that go to you know Constitutional Law Association, or I mean, I'm a lawyer, I study law here in Poland as well, so I kind of know the context. It's easier to see the political division in here. And in your case, first year student, you just got kicked out for saying something that at least a couple years ago was fairly normal in the UK. So
Yeah, yeah.
what was the story about that? Like, how did it actually happen?
Well, the context was I was elected onto the student council as the first year representative for welfare, and it was during the student council meeting that we had a debate on whenever we should allow the university officer corps to be allowed to advertise on campus, and this this military association basically. And for the longest time, they weren't allowed to advertise at our university because the student union deemed that they would offend international students by having their presidents on campus, as it would remind them of colonialism, despite these people choosing to study in Britain. Um, so that's why I argued. I typed in this chat when this debate was going on, and I said, well, if these people are so offended by our culture and by our country, and by our customs, then why did they choose to come and study at a British university? And someone in this meeting who was a friend of mine, who was half Korean and half Canadian, said, if it wasn't for the British Empire, my family wouldn't have had the independence they had in Korea. Sorry, it's been a while, so that's why I'm all over the place trying to remember. And anyway, I said in response to that, I said, "Rule Britannia, that's a good thing. It's a good thing that South Korea has been set up and isn't a communist state." Um, um, and this debate took place in December, and 2 months later, in February, so this month last year, I received an email from the student union saying that me saying Rule Britannia and me posing the question of, well, if you don't like this country, why did you come here, is racism. And so they banned me from the student union for 2 weeks. which would have prevented me at the time from attending any further student council meetings. And at the time, I thought it was done because they didn't want people who thought like me to attend these council meetings and to vote on legislation they wanted to go forward. Because in the end, there was a vote and the British military was allowed to come back on campus again to advertise, and they weren't happy about that whatsoever. So there was an effort to silence people like me who held such views. But the way they went about it backfired on them, because there's something deeply wrong about banning someone for a patriotic phrase or banning someone for freely thinking. So it blew up in the press in March, and that's where it all began.
All right, yeah. I mean, now it kind of blew up. That's the thing. It's something that in principle would have been very irrelevant, to be honest. I mean, in a normal context, it's just a conversation, among students in a normal student organization, and it blew up. And then I remember you wrote a couple articles for the Mallard, pretty much on the same subject. I was writing for the Mallard around the same time, so I do remember I disappeared for a while. All right. I was telling you, I remember seeing your post for the Mallard, and then it's been pretty much just, you're kind of part of these circles now. And I wanted to ask you, were you already somewhat more conservative or, more patriotic before? I mean, in our circles, there's certainly people who are more libertarian leaning, people who are more nationalistic leaning. But, we get along and we get together pretty much, especially when you don't get, into too radical or too fringe ideas, even if we're already kind of radical by today's standards. So my question for you was, were you already kind of conservative before? Was this something, that came naturally to you?
Like did I grow up patriotic and conservative?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, you were a first year student, so you might have had some previous influence, or it was just something that came out of you at that moment, and then you decided to just embrace what happened.
Well, back then, I was into politics. I had a I had a TikTok account that some people might recognize me from, where I used to make pro-British Empire videos, which looking back on is kind of cringe. And I can't rewatch those TikTok videos without cringing. They were really bad. But that's what people at the time knew me from. But even like, if I go further back than that, and even like growing up in Britain as a child, and I would say that I always leaned towards this love for my country. My dad, he was in the military. I grew up with a love for history, which is why I took it on at university. But it wasn't a love for history for international, global history. It was a love for my own country, really, and for the history of the people who came before me and built the civilization I know today. And I always felt strongly and deeply about the English countryside and its beauty, and its old ways. So in a way, I suppose I've always had these nationalistic or patriotic tendencies. But I started off politics. I think when I was 14 or 15, I think actually, and I initially supported the Labour Party because I thought this is the party that can help people, right? This is the party which wants to give to the working class and wants to look out for students and wants to make people's lives better. And I remember that all changed because I had a conversation with my grandfather, and he explained how such policies aren't economically feasible, and they're nice in writing, but not so nice in practice. So it really, I guess my interest in politics really started off when I was 15. And it started off really as a response to political correctness and the culture wars as well.
Yeah, well, Britain in particular tends to be quite harsh when it comes to free speech, and the culture wars have been really taking a hold on you. I remember there's this Anglican pastor. I don't know how to call him in particular, Calvin Robinson, and he was a pretty strong voice for more conservative church culture in the UK. You also had Brexit back in the day. Uh, I mean, it's been a couple things that has been having Great Britain compared to the rest of Europe, compared to the rest of the world. I don't know how different it might be for you than what it has happened in, let's say, in the United States. And I mean, you mentioned the like I'm going to go back to the rule Britannia thing and the criticism of colonialism. And I remember a while ago that they were tearing down statues of Cecil Rhodes in some universities, and taking out street names and such. And I mean, it's complicated because every country in Latin America, we have the Spanish legacy, Brazil, the Portuguese, in Canada, in Australia, in a lot of South Africa, India, you have the British legacy. And on one side, you have people in the UK who are very proud about that, and on the others, mostly the left, you have people that completely hate their history. I'm not even talking about their identity because it's not even similar anymore, but their history. Maybe my question for you is, how do you view that? Like, what's your perspective? What's your opinion on the whole culture wars and the clash, as someone who has been right in the middle of it in the UK?
Well, I think 2020 was really a turning point for how people viewed Britain. In response to the death of George Floyd, there was, Britain had its own Black Lives Matter movement, but our movement really solely focused on shaming British history, saying we need to decolonize the curriculum, whatever that means, and start teaching that we should be ashamed about what our ancestors did. We should be ashamed about the slave trade that happened 100 years ago before we were born, without actually informing us about the fact it was the British that got rid of the slave trade in the end and paved the way for other countries to stop it as well. But there was other things such as people introduced this idea of decolonizing things, but they never defined what decolonization meant in Britain. Because in American context, it would be, well, we need to focus on the Native Americans who came before us and were originally a part of this country, and we should learn of their ways, and we should stop this foreign mindset that we have. But the problem with Britain, of course, is that the natives are the British. And what people meant by this word decolonize was we should introduce foreign history. We should teach these citizens about the history of other countries to decolonize their mindset, which really just means to colonize their mindset and make them forget who they are and make them believe that there's no such thing as an indigenous Brit. So we really saw that push in 2020. And it's just been constant gaslighting from there, in the sense of people, I believe, grow up without an understanding of what British history is. They, in this country anyway, from a young age, they're taught, about how the Romans invaded, and then how it was the Anglo-Saxons who invaded, and then it was the Vikings and the Normans, and how, because we were invaded by these other Northern European groups, that means we're a country of immigrants. But of course, this all happened nearly 1,000 years ago. Yet people are brought up with that history to the point where they're not taught about their great heroes, or the tales of British antiquity. instead they're taught to believe that there's no greatness in British history, and that's the problem with the culture wars. It's completely anti-British.
Well, and by extension, it's pretty much anti-Western civilization. And there's plenty of things that you can think from British culture that have influenced the rest of the Western mindset. Plenty of books written by British authors. You have the Magna Carta as part of the legal tradition in the West. Maybe not as important as some other documents, maybe as important as some other documents as well. You had like folklore. I mean, everyone knows about King Arthur. Everyone knows about the Knights of the Round Table, even if it's like half French, half British.
But do they truly? I think people know of the stories of King Arthur, but no one's truly read them. No one has been truly brought up with them like our ancestors were.
Yeah, and I mean it's a shame because we see the push, and I mean maybe not in Poland. Poland is kind of a complicated case, and Latin America as well is another complicated case because different cultures. But at least in the in the English-speaking countries, in the UK, in the USA, in Australia, in Canada, you see how everything is being pushed to a certain direction. How people are just rejecting everything that has to do with Western history.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, for you, it might be more complicated because you have been studying that, and maybe you have a better grasp of what is happening in the classroom. What do they actually teach you? And it is, you have certain freedom to choose what you're learning, or do you have to just learn official history and you have to, just abide and comply with whatever they telling you, your professors and your lectures?
There's a set curricula throughout all of British primary schools. And then once you get to GCSEs, there's still a set curricula, but the teacher can choose which curricula they can choose to teach their students. Luckily in my school, I had a really good history teacher for GCSEs, and we did the history of the discovery of the New World. So we looked into the Spanish conquering the Aztecs. And I remember when I learned about that history, I thought it was amazing. I thought it was like a story you would read out of a fantasy book, but in reality it was all true. These Spanish Christians going to war with these cannibals who sacrifice their own citizens and treat other native tribes terribly. And then after we did that, we did the history of warfare in Britain. So we covered the Battle of Waterloo and Trafalgar. And then we looked into modern Britain. So we covered the post-war years, the Troubles in Northern Ireland, and Margaret Thatcher. So in my last couple of years of school, the history I was taught was fantastic. And then I went to sixth form. And I made the mistake of choosing modern history instead of medieval history for my A levels. So I did American history, which is quite strange to think we're taught about the history of the Americans instead of being taught about the history of our own country. But we did modern America from World War I all the way up to the 90s. And it looked into political history of America, so it went over all the presidents. But the course was really focused on just the civil rights movement in America, and that was about it. And then after we completed that module, we did British warfare again, which was really, really fascinating because we got to cover Lord Nelson and the Duke of Wellington. But with American history, there was certainly a narrative pushed with us being taught how evil Americans are and how racist they are, and how great the civil rights movement was. And then don't get me wrong, I believe that the civil rights movement was necessary, but there wasn't really a great focus on other aspects of American history. So that was my experience with history in school.
I mean, yeah, I suppose that is pretty similar in other countries. I, I mean, I do remember a certain bias when I was in school about, learning some stuff from a more progressive perspective. I still remember how I wasn't even in high school. We're learning about, French history. I studied in a French school when I was younger, and they would just push. I was 15, and it was like, oh, and yeah, and abortion was legalized with that president, and this president was the one who began the decolonization. And decolonization was interesting because for the French, it wasn't as traumatic as it might have been for the Brits. For the USA, it was as well. It was different. They didn't have colonies per se, and they were the ones pushing for to get more free, independent countries so they could export ideology against the Soviets. But there's always been a certain leaning when you get taught something, especially history. Politics now in university, it's completely different because I don't know if this is your case, but you might have the idea that everything you're taught, at least in politics, is already biased in a certain way. Maybe it is not. So far, what I've seen from people who have studied politics, even in law, there's always a bias. You can try to be as neutral as possible, especially if you're more, conservative leaning, but there's a bias. And maybe that's your experience studying politics as
No.
well. History is different.
Yeah, I've had a because I do history and politics. I've had a very good experience with the politics department at my university, and even I did a year abroad at Rhodes College in Memphis, Tennessee, and I had a very good experience with the politics department there as well. But at my university in Scotland, it's actually hard to tell what our professors' political beliefs are most of the time because they're that well balanced or they're that well thought out that they can critique every idea. But I would say my experience with classes at university, and I think I'm quite lucky in this incident, has actually been quite good. There hasn't been a massive left-wing bias pushed at my institutions.
Yeah, that's very fortunate for you, I suppose. Especially since, well, I don't know if that's the case. Like in the UK, you have Oxbridge, and you have a couple other good universities. I think St Andrews, Aberdeen, Scotland. In the UK, you have the Ivies, and at least the general trend with good universities that they have just become um, feeding ground for ideologues and for activists. And maybe you are lucky in the sense that you are not being pushed towards that narrative,
Mm-hmm.
and maybe then you are learning for real when in other places it is not what is happening.
Yeah.
I can tell you, like in the university I study in Poland, it is certainly the best, but at the same time, it's one of the most progressives. It's the Jagiellonian University in Krakow.
Yeah.
And I mean, people can be conservative, like openly conservative. You're not going to be excluded per se, which is good. But that pretty much everyone else leans left. At
Mm-hmm.
least you have like that openness. Maybe I don't know if that's different because as well you're in Scotland
Yeah.
and Oxbridge is in England, so maybe there might be a difference about Scottish culture per se versus English culture. And I will ask you about this later because I told you about Brexit and there might be some issues with Scottish independence. But maybe first let's begin with this. Is there like you perceive that there might be a difference between English uh, university culture and Scottish university culture, or is it just pretty much the same?
I would say it's pretty much the same. But then again, I haven't studied at an English university. But I'll tell you this. Just this is going off your question, but I thought it'd be important to say the best experience I ever had at university in one of my courses was a philosophy course at Rhodes College in America, and the course was called Political Questions, and we had this professor. He looked like a professor you would imagine. He had like white crazy hair. He looked like a mad scientist, but he had a brilliant personality and a brilliant charisma to him. And the first thing he made us do on the very first day of taking that class was to read the course guide. And the course guide basically outlined how the virtue of academia is the pursuit of knowledge and it's the pursuit of truth, and how uncomfortable feelings are essential to learning and how we should embrace them instead of rejecting them. So what he was trying to outline in this course guide was if you want trigger warnings or you want to be wrapped up in a cotton ball, this isn't a class for you. And the class was great. The second reading he made us do was Plato's Cave, which is this story of escaping your comfort zone and embracing truth. And he also made us read books on equality. There was one story where it outlined what true equality would look like. People having to have to wear headphones which would constantly buzz in their ear so they couldn't think, and they could be equal to those with lower IQs. How athletes would have to be weighed down with weights and so on so they could be equal to those who are disabled. So we got the class thinking on, well, what does equality mean? Is equality worth striving towards? If this is the true version of what a world of equality would look like? And then he got us to read other stuff. For example, he got us to read about how the gender wage gap wasn't real, and how we should read the facts and information to make our own conclusions instead of, believing whatever we're told. And he was a really great professor. I used to work for the Republican Party in Memphis. I was the vice president somehow of the Republican Society there, and I met this gentleman who told me that the professor who taught our class was actually a libertarian who supported the Republican Party, and that's really shocking to come across actual conservative professors at university. And it's even more shocking to actually come across professors who encourage the true virtue of academia, which is the pursuit of truth and knowledge. And there was one more book he got us to read, and it was Isbin's Enemy of the People. And the moral of the story of that play is it's better to pursue truth and to be hated than to pursue falsehood and be loved. So he was always encouraging us to pursue truth, no matter the consequence it may have on our reputations. And that course was great. But in relation to your question of how different is Aberdeen to English universities, I simply don't know. I don't know how different Aberdeen is compared to Edinburgh, for example, or Glasgow, or St Andrews. I think it differs between course and course, and university because there's always different people teaching you who have different personalities and different pursuits.
Well, with that said, maybe my question was very, very particular about universities, but Britain, at least since it's been almost 10 years since Brexit took over the whole process, it actually was finalized, and in the meantime you also had the Scottish independence movement gaining traction. How you as a Brit feel about that, and how have you lived that? I mean, you were younger, way younger when everything began, and right now you're almost finishing uni.
Mm-hmm.
So you have been right. You have been growing up right during all of that, both Brexit and kind of the failure of the Scottish independence movement.
Yeah. So So it's a question, what is my thoughts on Scottish independence?
Yeah, pretty much. It's always like that. I just throw ideas and, you can cue on them.
I remember vividly the referendum back in 2014. I think it was 2014. And I remember, because my family's from Scotland. My grandmother, she's from a town called Alexandria, which is north of Glasgow and right next to Loch Lomond. And my father was born in Scotland, and I went to Scotland quite a few times as a child. It was very much celebrated Burns Night. I was proud to be Scottish. I thought Scotland was a beautiful place, and it is the country of my ancestors. But during the referendum in 2014, I knew there was something seriously wrong about Scotland wanting to split away from the United Kingdom, because I understood that Britain wasn't just England. It was far more than that. It's the island to which we all belong. So for a country to become fully independent and to have sovereignty would mean severe consequences for the future of Britain, and for the relationship the rest of the countries, Wales, Northern Ireland, and England would have with Scotland. It's like, for example, imagine, I don't know, in America, imagine if Texas became independent, actually became independent. And that would be like a big part of American culture ripped away. It's like having your hand cut off or your arm removed. It's just, you're just not complete without it. But I remember the referendum. I think I was 12 during the referendum. I wasn't even into politics. I never even thought about politics whatsoever. And I knew there was something deeply wrong about Scotland splitting away from the United Kingdom. But as I grew older, and I heard the arguments of Scottish independence, and I live in Scotland now, so I hear it all the time from some people. I think it's a completely stupid idea. I think the reasoning people have for wanting to split away from England is not one that understands British history. It's actually quite the opposite. It's a misunderstanding of British history. A lot of people will say, well, we don't want to be a part of the United Kingdom because what on earth did William Wallace fight for? What on earth did Robert the Bruce, fight for, and so on? William Wallace, he was hanged, drawn, and quartered, and died for Scottish freedom, and that's one of Scotland's national heroes. But in reality, when you look into the Scottish Wars for Independence, and that's one of my keen interests as well, you start to realise that Scotland wasn't opposed to the idea of a United Kingdom. They were opposed to the rule of Edward I and having to be involved in the French wars and heavy taxation. They didn't like that, that they were having to deal with oppressive policies. The rest of England was having to deal with such policies as well and wasn't too happy about it. So it really came out of the people being fed up of how they were treated by their government in that sense. Because when you look back to the Great Cause, the Scottish were for King Alexandria's granddaughter, Margaret of Norway, marrying Edward I's son, Edward II. And that in itself would have created, a United Kingdom similar to that which we have today by these two crowns coming together. But sadly, Margaret of Norway, she died, unfortunately, and then the Great Cause happened. But, British history and Scotland's relationship with England goes back further than that. With our ancestors, back in the medieval period, understood Geoffrey of Monmouth's work, which argued that we were all descended from Brutus, that Brutus's sons ruled over England, Wales, and Scotland. And so people understood that they were really the same race of people, that they shared this common ancestor, that there was, a shared sense of Britishness between these kingdoms. So sadly, I believe that this want for Scottish independence really does come out of a misunderstanding of what it means to be British and what the United Kingdom is. I think if we're going to have an independent Scotland, we should have an independent Mercia. We should restore the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms if that's the case. We should have the Kingdom of Northumbria and take Edinburgh back for the English. It's just, if I feel like if we split one part of our kingdom, then we have to split the rest. There has to be independent Wales and independent Mercia and Northumbria and Wessex, for example.
You know, on one side, that would be a very libertarian argument towards, you know, the disintegration of Great Britain, because you will have all of these tiny petty kingdoms, each you know, ruled locally. On the other side, yeah, you also have the issue that most of the Scottish independentists, they tend to be also Republicans, and you know, part of the central political identity of Great Britain is, you know, the monarchy.
Another argument that they make, which kind of makes sense, they say, well, Scotland doesn't care about, well, not sorry, Westminster doesn't care about Scotland's interests. Why should we be ruled by Westminster that doesn't even care about the people? But the issue that the Scots have with making that argument is they fail to realise that Westminster doesn't care about anyone. They don't care about North England. They don't care about any of England. They don't care about Wales. They don't care about Northern Ireland. They only care about benefiting themselves, getting elected, and furthering their own careers. So it's really this satisfaction with the government which has really caused this want for Scottish independence and this disconnect to England, and failing to understand that England's equally fed up with the rule of Westminster as well. So it's Scottish independence really is what happens when you don't truly try to represent the interests of the people.
Yeah, and there goes the populist argument as well. But you know, aside from that, which you might find on the right, on the left, I mean, Brexit was pretty much a populist movement on that sense. It's we're fed up with the bureaucrats in Brussels telling us what to do with our country. With people in Scotland saying pretty much we're fed with the people at Westminster telling us what to do with our country. But you know, it's something that just keeps on happening here and there. You know, you might have populists growing in Northern Ireland. You might have the same in Wales, and yet, I mean, you're named after the late Queen Elizabeth. So right now you have Charles, who is also sick. I mean, the monarchy is pretty much what keeps the country together when everything else fails. So what happens in that case? I mean, because as I was telling you, the Scottish independence movement tends to be Republican, whereas conservatives in the UK, they're, you know, monarchies by default, you know, and the rest, you know, Labour doesn't have an official opinion. You have people like Corbyn, who was kind of a Republican as well. So what goes, especially in a moment like, you know, the current one in which Charles is sick, he might die.
Yeah, I mean, the problem with the Tories and Labour is that they're two sides of the same coin. I think Labour is of the position of whatever will get them elected, but they'll never hold to that. But in relation to Scottish Republicans, I think their dislike of the monarchy comes more from why should an individual be able to live a luxurious life, have little power, whilst we're living in absolute poverty and we don't have any opportunity at all. And that's what one problem with Scotland is. A lot of people do live in poverty. For example, in Glasgow, I think it's either the first or second drug capital of Europe at the moment. I think Dundee is the first drug capital, which shows how severe the problem of poverty in Scotland is. And we've seen this pattern in history before. For example, the reason in the Roman Republic that the people had this distaste for the partitions, the Senate, is because they were living in immense wealth, more wealth than their ancestors could ever have imagined, whilst basic Roman citizens were poorer than their own parents. They had less land and less opportunity. They didn't even qualify for military service. So I think it's a normal reaction for people to to say, well, why should this person live in luxury whilst we're living in decay? So I think that's where it came from.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty much the argument against monarchy everywhere. But for Britain, it is more complex than that because it is, the prime symbol of your culture. Compared to other countries, I mean, think of Belgium. The monarchy is the only thing keeping Belgium, together. But in the UK, if you think of the UK, at least until Queen Elizabeth was, when she was still alive, you think, oh, the Queen. It's kind of it's the ideal of British identity. You have monarchy by default.
Yeah.
How do you deal with that?
Like in the sense of like well, I think the monarchy is still very popular. I think it's only, well, I don't think it is. It's only a tiny minority of people which are Republican, even among the Scottish, even, and more Scots support the Union as well than they support Scottish independence. But the monarchy in Britain, it's really essential in representing, well, what Britain is, because when you think back to the monarchy, it can trace its roots not just back to 1066, but predating that, it can trace its roots back to the Anglo-Saxon monarchs. So it's this symbol really of how this figurehead has united not only us today, but all of our ancestors and all the people who came before us. So when you get rid of the monarchy, you're really getting rid of a central part of your civilization. And I think that's the trouble of these arguments that we should be rid of the monarchy, is that they don't truly care for British culture and for British tradition. It's more of this hatred of this country.
Well, I'm going to make kind of a dramatic cut, because when you think of some of the British traditions, or those symbols that make of Britain, I mean, you're Scottish, about the tartans, and all of what people think of Scotland. Then again, when you think about English and British, you have the Barbour jackets. I'm going to the aesthetics because aesthetics tend to be quite important, at least in how people perceive things. And I mean, there is a certain idea that British stuff tends to be posh, tends to be somewhat pretentious. And I don't know if that was your experience when you studied for a while in the US. In here in Poland, we have kind of a different idea of how that works, but that's mostly because we receive very drunk British tourists. I mean, how does that work, especially in the aesthetics? I mean, because I know that you're kind of like an aesthetic girl and all of that.
Well, I have a Barbour jacket myself, but I didn't buy it. My mum gave me it for my birthday. I actually inherited it, and it has its padding on its arms has been replaced by my dad's old military uniform, so it's quite unique in that sense. So I inherited it, but I think that there's something beautiful, truly, about British aesthetics, and it's that the British, they used to, and some still do. They know how to dress very well. But then you see this modern British culture that's arising, which is the image that Americans now have of us today, which is, people wear Nike and they dress like what they dress as roadmen, as we call it, very chavvy. And the women, as Americans describe it, have orange faces and awful contour and heavy makeup, and they're not very pretty, because that is taking place in Britain. It's that, we were once this civilization of fashion and beauty, but now we're increasingly becoming the civilization of ugliness in that sense. And there's a big problem of that in Britain. And the same with our architecture. When you look at old British architecture, even in the medieval period, is that it's utterly beautiful. When you go to the Victorian era, despite industrialization, there's still something quite pretty about the architecture we have. but then you reach after the 1950s and after the war period, you all of a sudden start getting buildings built out of concrete and brutalism. I mean, I live in Aberdeen right now for university, and we literally have Soviet blocks all around the city. These flats which look like something from the Soviet Union. Actually, they film, unironically, they film Soviet movies in Aberdeen. It's that bad. There was one movie about, I think, the guy who made Tetris, who I think he was from a former Soviet bloc country, and they literally filmed it in Aberdeen because all the architecture kind of mimics the Soviet bloc. And really, fashion and architecture, it reflects the character of what Britain now is. It's not a country which tries to strive towards the higher forms and beauty and goodness and virtue, but it's a country that's started to crumble. You can really see that in how Britain presents itself today. But that said, people, if you go out to the country where it's still beautiful and there's still wonderful architecture, people still wear tweed. They still dress very well. And when you go to towns in Britain, which just are completely beautiful, like Shrewsbury in Shropshire, Chester in Cheshire, and cities in the south, or Edinburgh, or St Andrews, and so on, it's that people still dress well because their architecture reflects their character.
I do have a little tension about that because, well, right now I'm working as well. In my day job, when you work for a tech company, people tend to be very comfortable and they just wear hoodies and sweatpants. And it's not. I mean, it's not very nice to see. And I just try to, like, at least 3 times a week, I try to go in like a dress shirt, jacket, even a tie every now and then. And the city which I live works for that. I mean, you try to look better. You try to wear, better, more stylish clothes, especially during the winter. I really like the winter because of that, because everyone is forced to wear a coat and a scarf, and at least it makes everyone look a little bit more formal. But then you go at work, heated building, everyone's just wearing a hoodie.
Mm-hmm.
It's a different kind of context, and I understand why you combine architecture and fashion as elements of beauty in society. And I mean, for someone who has lived in the US and in Europe, for me it's kind of complicated to see that. It's it's just a degradation of general social aesthetics and of social mores.
Mm-hmm.
But people don't seem to care.
Yeah, well, we have to ask ourselves, why do people wear hoodies in the office? Why do people wear tracksuits? And they don't wear flattering, beautiful clothes. It's because, well, it requires effort. People I think the thing that defines also the civilization at the moment, and particularly Western civilization, is that people are too comfortable. They prefer comfort from discomfort, and you can see that in a multitude of things. For example, academia. People don't like hearing opinions they disagree with. They don't like being offended. They don't like these feelings of discomfort, which were essential to our ancestors. If you go back to the medieval period, people went to war. They fought. They died. They got injured. If you go back further than that, when people lived in small settlements, they had to constantly go hunting and the women had to make sure their homes were in order and so on. It's that discomfort truly defined those who came before us. But now we have everything given to us. We don't really have to strive and be uncomfortable to get what we want. And I think that's why we've become too soft in that sense, and why we prefer to be comfortable than uncomfortable.
Yeah, and even about my personal case, I do believe that there's a merit in the struggle. When you're struggling, when you're struggling, but you're trying to keep yourself together, you become more creative. You find ways to just sort it out in a good way. You survive. And maybe, I mean, some of the things from British culture, that also in general from European culture, that have a lot of to do with that is how hunting clothes and gamekeepers and everything that has to do with hunting has developed and evolved over time. And when you see how modern society is just very comfortable, everything is just given, everything, and people are expecting that, and that's one of the issues, and that's why people are pushing for more government, for more social programs, which on one side, not all of them are bad. They really help people every now and then, but I mean, people are just expecting to be given stuff for nothing, and they're just rioting and asking for that. Maybe that's what is really saying something about our society and our civilization in general right now. The British case is different from the American case, both different from the general European continental case and from Latin America, but it's pretty much the same feeling. It's the same idea that we just want more free stuff.
Yeah.
And how do you get free stuff? I mean, I don't know how the economy is going in the UK right now. In Europe, it's a mixed bag. Latin America, by default, is always bad, and well, in the United States, they're just printing machine go brr. So I mean, it's complicated. Free stuff is never free, and I mean, you might be a little more libertarian leaning in that. I mean, I am also more libertarian leaning when it comes to economics, but it's hard to go like full neocon and say we only have to care about the GDP and about like interest rates and inflation. It also has something to do with how society is going. And the problem is that on one side we try to keep beauty, we try to keep culture alive, we try to keep history, but on the other we have to take care of the complexities of modern society, which tend very much to be all about economics and finance. And you have to deal with that because history and politics, they tend to be quite divergent. History tends to be a little more romantic. Politics tends to become very, very technical. So anyway, what's your opinion on that, especially since you're in the middle of studying two things that tend to be quite diverging?
Sorry, what's the specific question?
sorry, I just I was meandering. I mean, politics is becoming more and more technical because of all of the financial economic complexities that you have to deal. History on the other side still has that romantic aspect, not very technical. People just rely more on accounts. Yeah, so how do you deal with that? How do you deal with that tension?
Well, we have to ask ourselves, well, what is history? What's the purpose of studying history? It isn't just because you might find romance and the ways our ancestors lived, like settlements in the Anglo-Saxon era. But the real virtue of history is that it teaches us all the lessons we need for society today. Because when you start looking into the Roman Republic, and that's my best example, is that everything that we're struggling with today, and the political questions that we're asking ourselves today, have already been repeated in history. And you can see that, for example, with populism in the Roman Republic. A lot of people tend to ask now, why is populism in the rise? What is populism, for example? Well, to truly understand what populism is, you can look back to the case of Tiberius Gracchus, when he was killed by the Senate with wooden chair legs because he dared try to represent the poorest of the Roman population, because they had the land taken by the Senate, who were illegally expanding it to put slaves on this land, meaning Roman citizens not only had less land, but they couldn't even get employed because they were replaced by foreign slaves, which kind of reminds you of the similar problems today with immigration. People, the poorest in society, are living in a housing crisis, and low-skilled workers are having their jobs taken by by cheap labour abroad. So you see those patterns today, but in relation to populism in the Roman Republic, is that teaches us how populism rises when the people aren't represented, and when the people believe that the government does not care to represent their interests. Because the virtue of government, for example, I know I keep going on the rant about populism here when I'm really talking about the virtue of history, but the purpose of government is to represent the people. So when populism itself becomes its own political ideology and its own political party, in protest to the mainstream establishment, there's something deeply wrong. Politics is no longer following the virtue it should. So the Roman Republic teaches that. It teaches us that the problems we're facing today have already happened. And there's similar stories in history, which also give us similar stories to that which we're facing today. And an article I've recently written, and I'm still waiting for it to be released, is about the Anglo-Saxons and Ethelfled, and how when England was down to its last Anglo-Saxon kingdom, in the face of the Vikings, they were able to fight the Vikings off and establish the Kingdom of England under Aethelstan. And the real virtues of the British character is that of resilience and determination, which I think is an important lesson the British need to be taught today in modern British politics. So that's the purpose of history. The purpose of history truly is looking to the past to find solutions, because our ancestors were equally as smart and equally as similar to us today, even if we don't want to admit it.
All right. Well, I think that's a great way to end the episode. I wouldn't add anything more, especially since most people in these circles, they just lean too much into an abstract idea of tradition, and we're just conserving something, but not really into learning history, learning what really happened before, and especially looking at other sources. I mean, maybe Americans, they just think, oh, America began with the Independence Wars and the Constitution, and then everything is just USA. In Europe, I mean, some people just see, oh, European Union, and that's the only thing that matters, forgetting 1,000 years of medieval history, and even before that, the Roman times. You're making a lot of reference to Roman, to the Gracchus brothers. So, I mean, I wouldn't add anything else. So, I think we're wrapping up here. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure talking to you. Well,
thank you for having me.
All right.